This
Okay.
is the 7th chapter of the laws of Passover in the Mishneh Torah, which can be found on Chabad.org. Okay, you can begin.
Okay. It is a positive commandment of the Torah to relate the miracles and wonders wrought for our ancestors in Egypt on the night of the 15th of Nisan, as Exodus chapter 13 verse 3 states, "Remember this day on which you left Egypt," just as Exodus chapter 20 verse 8 states, "Remember the Shabbat day."
Okay, so you may know this, what this word means, but I'm going to tell people just in case they don't know, because it's not a very common English word. I hate the fact that our lessons are also kind of like English lessons, but maybe it's also a good thing. So wrought, it's just a very fancy way of saying did, right? So it's just saying miracles and wonders that were done for our ancestors in Egypt. It's people don't usually speak with this word, but they will write it in books. It's just a nice way of saying done or did. All right, let's continue.
From where is it derived that this mitzvah is to be fulfilled on the night of the 15th? From where it is derived that this mitzvah is to be fulfilled on night of the 15th? The Torah teaches, Exodus chapter 13 verse 8, "And you shall tell your son on that day, saying it is because of this," implying that the mitzvah is to be fulfilled. The matzah and maror are placed before you.
All right. So matzah, that is the unleavened bread, and the maror, that is the bitter herbs. Okay, and in the last chapter, which I recorded right before we started talking, we talked about the fact that the only CHAMETS refers to leavened bread that puffed up. But the only bread that the Torah forbids, does not allow as CHAMETS, that is only bread that became puffed up from the 5 special kinds of grain that are mentioned in the Torah. So that's like, well, we can look it up real fast. Right? So they are wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and the 5th one is called shibolet shu'al. And the reason they did not translate it here is because there is some disagreement among the religious scholars whether shibolet shu'al refers to oats, like in oatmeal, or whether it's a certain species of barley, like another species of barley. Because some of these are basically just a subspecies of wheat, but also the reason they think that shibolet shu'al is oats is based on some old commentaries, such as Rashi, who identified shibolet shu'al as being oats. However, Rashi lived in Europe and was not familiar with the kinds of grains that grew in the land of Israel. So there are actually archaeologists who dispute that shibolet shu'al are oats. And from what I've read, there's more evidence that shibolet shu'al is another kind of barley. So there are 2 types of barley that are forbidden. But long story short, the only kind of chametz that's forbidden is when the chametz, the leavened bread, is from these. If it's from anything else like rice or beans or lentils, it is not chametz. We are not concerned about it. Seder? Did I lose you? I think, I don't know if you're there. I talked too much. Mar Yosef.
Yes.
You with us?
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, brother. Say.
Okay. So, yeah, so the same way that chametz is only one of these 5 kinds of grain that become leavened, This is also
Brother,
true for, it's also true for
brother,
matzah. Yes, sir.
yes, yes. I am very, very sorry. I have a little bit work uh,
Okay.
because somebody is waiting for me in the market, and he
Oh, no
brings,
problem.
yeah, he bring some type of because in my house we are making some this construction. It is construction work.
Okay.
So that is why somebody brings some things for the construction purpose. So I am busy for only 10 to 15 or 30 minutes.
Okay, you can come back whenever you want. The same link
Yes,
should work.
I will message you on Facebook. So
You
then
can
we will.
just click that same link that you did here and come right in.
Okay, okay, no
Okay.
problem.
All
We
right.
will start from. Yes, yes.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
very, very sorry. Very, very
No,
sorry.
no problem.
Anim is Tahir.
Lo davar. Hatidag. Don't worry.
Okay,
Yalla.
okay,
See
okay.
you, brother. Yalla, bye.
Okay, 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 brother. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom uvracha. So we learned in the previous chapter that the same way that CHAMETS only refers to leavened bread from those 5 grains that are mentioned in the Torah, this is also true for the kind of matzah that we are supposed to eat on the first night of Passover. That matzah must also be made from one of the 5 grains. If it is not made from one of those 5 grains, then we do not fulfill the commandment to eat matzah on the first night of Passover. So matzah made just from rice or lentils or anything like that, it does not work. It needs to be from one of the 5 grains. Okay. So the Torah teaches in Exodus chapter 13, verse 8, and you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of this, ... implying that the mitzvah is to be fulfilled when matzah and maror, bitter herbs, are placed before you. The mitzvah applies even though one does not have a son. Even great sages are obligated to tell about the exodus from Egypt. Whoever elaborates concerning the events which occurred and took place is worthy of praise. By elaborates, they just mean talks more about it, even more, they expound on it. It is a mitzvah to inform one's sons, even though they do not ask. As Exodus chapter 13, verse 8 states, you shall tell your son. A father should teach his son according to the son's knowledge. How is this applied? If the son is young or foolish, he should tell him, my son, in Egypt, we were all slaves like this maidservant with his slave. On this night, the Holy One, blessed be He, redeemed us and took us out of Egypt to freedom. And clearly we see that there's not much political correctness 2,000 years ago. If the son is older and wise, he should inform him what happened to us in Egypt and the miracles wrought for us by Moses, our teacher, everything according to the son's knowledge. He should make changes on this night during that meal, the Passover meal that we will have next Friday night. He should make changes on this night so that the children will see and will be motivated to ask, why is this night different from all other nights? Until he replies to them, this and this occurred, this and this took place, referring to the Exodus. What changes should be made? He should give them roasted seeds and nuts, something that's not normally done. The table should be taken away before they eat. Matzot should be snatched from each other, and the like. So you do different things that you don't normally do in a meal, even on a holiday, in order to arouse the children to ask questions. And we do this because we want the questions to be sincere. We don't want it to just be force-fed. We don't want to have to pull the questions out of them. And these are just examples. You could do other things. The Jewish establishment basically does sort of the same things every year. So the children already know what's going to happen. So it would probably be a good idea if you change it up from year to year. One year do one thing different, and the next year do something else different, so that you will catch your children off guard, and it'll be a new surprise every year to make them ask questions. When a person does not have a son, his wife should ask him. If he does not have a wife, he and a colleague should ask each other, why is this night different? This applies even if they are all wise. A person who is alone should ask himself, why is this night different? And of course, ideally, a person should not be alone. So if any of you know someone who would be keeping Passover all alone, please invite them. Even if you don't have a whole lot of money or food to provide for him, anything would be better than nothing. Perhaps you can offer him to do some kind of chore for you, or to make it up to you in some other way. But the main purpose of these holidays is to bring people together, not just that someone should sit alone in a depressing corner in their house all by themselves doing this alone. It's not the way that Hashem wants us to keep these holidays, and that's specified in many places. One of the greatest aspects of the holidays is to bring joy to the widow, to the orphan, and to the convert or the immigrant, people who are often neglected. These are opportunities to let them know that they are loved. One must begin the narrative describing our ancestors' base roots. Pure base doesn't mean just foundational. It means like shameful or embarrassing roots. Our ancestors' embarrassing roots, and conclude with their praise. What does this imply? One begins telling how originally, in the age of Terah, that is the father of Abraham, our ancestors denied God's existence and strayed after vanity, pursuing idol worship. So we begin telling the story about the Exodus by acknowledging the fact that the origins of the Jewish people are no different than the origins of all other people on earth. The Jewish people don't come from some kind of special blood. It's not about blood. If it were about blood, then we are nothing special, because the people of Israel originate from non-Jewish, non-Israelite idolaters, ancient pagans, just like everybody else. The only thing that makes us unique is choosing to follow in the ways of God, to follow his instruction and seek his wisdom and reason. So one begins with our shameful and embarrassing origins, and we conclude with the true faith, how the omnipresent, how God has drawn us close to him, separated us from the nations, and drawn us near to his singularity, to his oneness. Similarly, one begins by stating that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and describing all the evil done to us, and concludes with the miracles and wonders that were wrought upon us, that were done for us, and our freedom. This implies that one should extrapolate the passage beginning from Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 5, "An Aramean sought to destroy my ancestor," until one concludes the entire passage. Whoever adds and extends his extrapolation of this passage is praiseworthy. By extrapolation, it just means expounding upon and giving commentary to these passages from the Torah regarding the Exodus. So you want to read a little bit from Deuteronomy chapter 26 during the Passover. If you hear a funny noise in the background, that's a cat crying. Probably wants her mother, who is probably behind a closed door or something. So I apologize if you can hear that. Okay. Halakha number 5. Looks like somebody joined us. Did he come back? I don't know. Halakha number 5. Halakha Hamesh. Whoever does not mention these 3 matters on the night of the 15th, which will be next Friday night, has not fulfilled his obligation. They are Pesach, referring to the Passover offering, Matzah, the unleavened bread, and Maror, the bitter herbs. The Passover sacrifice is eaten because the omnipresent passed over the houses or skipped over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt, as Exodus chapter 12, verse 27 states, "And you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to God. It is the skipping over of Hashem, of God." So the literal meaning of Pesach means to skip over. It can also mean to limp, basically. The bitter herbs, they are eaten because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our ancestors in Egypt. The matzah, the unleavened bread, it is eaten because of the redemption. These statements are all referred to as the Haggadah. Haggadah actually means the telling over of something, the recounting of something. Halakha Shesh. The sixth halakha. In each and every generation, a person must present himself as if he himself has now left the slavery of Egypt. As Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 23 states, He took us out from there. Regarding this manner, God commanded in the Torah, remember that you were a slave, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. That is to say, as if you yourself were a slave and went out to freedom and were redeemed. Halakha Sheva. Therefore, when a person feasts on this night, he must eat and drink while he is reclining in the manner of free men. Each and every one, both men and women, must drink 4 cups of wine on this night. This number should not be reduced. Even a poor person who is sustained by charity should not have fewer than 4 cups. The size of each of these cups should be a quarter of a log. It's roughly the amount that you could hold in your cheeks, one big cheek full. This is probably a good place to mention that unlike in the Islamic faith and in many parts of the Christian faith, the Jewish establishment, even the Jewish religious establishment, really has no stigma against drinking alcoholic beverages. And that's something that many people who don't have much experience with the Jewish faith may find astounding or shocking. But even though the Jewish people don't have much stigma with alcoholic beverages, there really is not a widespread problem of alcoholism among the Jewish people. That's not to say it does not exist, but it is not as rampant as it is in many other parts of human population. That said, I would say that if you know for sure that someone in your family, someone in your congregation, or someone who will be joining you for the Passover Seder, the festive meal that we have on the first night of Passover, if you know that someone who will be present is struggling with alcoholism, abusing alcohol, or they did in the past, I would recommend against using actual wine. Grape juice would probably be a more ethical decision. But it makes sense why wine is very often referred to in Jewish law, and it also emphasizes the difference, points out the difference between the Jewish reality and the Muslim and Christian realities throughout history. So the Islamic and Christian worlds have, for millennia, been sustained by Muslim and Christian governments, which provided a lot of funding for religious establishments through their regions. This allowed for larger, even massive churches and mosques. And you can really see the difference between the degree of wealth of the Christian and Muslim establishments as opposed to the Jewish establishment, quite contrary to the stereotypes against Jews that Jews are rich. I mean, you look at the size and conditions of synagogues as opposed to churches and mosques, and it's quite apparent. But this can also be reflected in some of the customs, because in ancient times, we did not have running water. In order to drink water, you would have to boil it, unless you had a certain amount set aside that had been pre-boiled if you did not want to get sick from it. And furthermore, if you would just have juice, that juice will more easily go rancid or sour, not in the way that's preferred with wine. So if you have a lot of juice, you don't want to waste that juice, and it ends up being a waste. With wine, on the other hand, it can keep for much longer, and that's why wine is more common. Okay, not to mention how it does lift the spirits, and there is nothing against Jewish law or against God's word for having your spirits lifted. Even though the Hebrew Bible has many statements against drunkenness in no uncertain terms, yet there's also a passage in the book of Proverbs where it says to give wine to the man who is lowly heart or depressed. I forget the exact wording in the book of Proverbs. So wine is like a medicine, but as with other medicines, it can be abused. And if someone has an issue of abusing it, we should take that into account. Okay, halacha shemone, the 8th halacha. Even one of Israel's poor should not eat until he can recline, right? A woman need not recline. It doesn't say she can't, but she doesn't need to, possibly because of societal norms, or she would feel uncomfortable doing so because of, again, cultural norms of modesty or whatever, or maybe she's so busy with children. They didn't want to burden her with that. If she's an important woman, she must recline. The Hebrew doesn't actually say she's obligated to. It says she should or needs to. Not exactly the standard terminology for actual obligation. Even a son in the presence of his father or an attendant in the presence of his master must recline. However, a student before his teacher should not recline unless his teacher grants him permission. Reclining on one's right side is not considered reclining, and it's talking about the reclining of the upper class of ancient Rome and Greece, right? So we're giving an atmosphere to emphasize that we are like royalty after having been freed by God from Egypt. Neither is reclining on one's back or forward. And if you do a search on Google, you'll see many examples of like ancient Roman and Greek leaders or other royalties in ancient empires leaning on their sides with somebody dropping grapes in their mouths or something. That's the idea. When must one recline? When eating the kazait, the olive-sized portion of matzah, and when drinking these 4 cups of wine. While eating and drinking at other times, if one reclines, it's praiseworthy, but if not, it's not a requirement. And there's also some debate as to whether or not there's a real requirement to recline at all in modern times, since it's no longer associated with royalty or dignitaries in modern society. So not a big deal if it's not very practical for you. Safek darabanan lakel. Okay, halacha tesha, the 9th halacha. These 4 cups of wine should be mixed with water so that drinking them will be pleasant. The degree to which they are mixed all depends on the wine and the preference of the person drinking. Together, these 4 cups should contain at least 1/4 of a log of pure wine. All right, mirvi'it yain hai. So this does specify actual alcoholic wine, but again, it's not worth the hardships and possible moral problems that will come along with it if this is being done in the presence of someone who is an alcoholic. So please take that into consideration. And again, a ravi'it, it's about a cheekful of wine, a cheekful of a fluid. A person who drank these 4 cups from wine which was not mixed with water has fulfilled the obligation to drink 4 cups of wine, but he has not fulfilled the obligation to do so in a manner expressive of freedom. A person who drank these 4 cups of wine mixed with water at one time has fulfilled the obligation to drink wine in a manner expressive of freedom, but has not fulfilled the obligation of 4 cups of wine. A person who drank the majority of the cup from each of these 4 cups has fulfilled his obligation. On each of these 4 cups, one recites a blessing of its own in addition. On the first cup, he recites the kiddush, right? Pertaining to the day. So kiddush refers to the sanctification of the day. That's on the first cup of wine, or the leil Seder, that we will do on next Friday night. On the second cup, one reads the Haggadah, the retelling of the story of Exodus. On the third cup, one recites the grace after meals, which is a Torah obligation. On the fourth cup, one concludes the Hallel and recites the blessing for the songs of praise. And between these cups, one should drink as he desires. Between the third and fourth cup, one should not drink. The Haroset. The Haroset is a mitzvah, it's a commandment ordained by the words of the sages. So we do not regard that as a Torah obligation, but it's a rabbinic obligation to commemorate the clay with which our forefathers worked in Egypt. How is Haroset made? We take dates, dried figs or raisins and the like and crush them. add vinegar, and mix them with spices, as clay is mixed into straw. This is placed on the table the first 2 nights of Passover. According to the Torah, the eating of bitter herbs is not a mitzvah in its own right, but rather is dependent on the consumption of the Passover sacrifice. That's as opposed to the eating of matzah. It is one positive commandment to eat the meat of the Passover sacrifice together with matzah and the bitter herbs. According to the words of the sages, it is a mitzvah to eat the bitter herbs alone on this night, even if there is no Passover sacrifice. So that is by rabbinic decree, not by direct Torah command. So by Torah law, the command of eating bitter herbs is when you eat it with the Passover sacrifice and with the matzah together. But during a situation where we are not able to eat the actual Passover sacrifice, then we still eat the bitter herbs, not because the Torah commands it. We do not consider it a Torah command to eat by itself, but we do so because the sages ordered us to do so. And this is like many things, in order that we will not forget the practice until we will be able to resume it in its proper way in the future, God willing. Because according to Torah, the Passover offering is still a valid command. It's not a law that just disappears because the temple's destroyed. The law is still applicable. The only reason we don't do it now is not because it's not applicable, but because if we were to make the Passover sacrifice, which should be done in the place that Hashem would choose in Jerusalem, you would almost certainly be arrested or possibly even attacked by extremist, quote-unquote, Palestinian Muslim terrorists. So that's the real reason it's not done. Not because it can't be or shouldn't be, but because the nations of the world don't want us to do it. Fact of the matter is, probably most nations of the world don't really care, except that the Arab world is so influential in the world with its fossil fuels that so many countries are dependent on, that they don't want to side with anything that will upset the Arab and Islamic world, which of course has a lot of bitterness and bigotry against the people of Israel based on their misunderstandings of history and crazy beliefs. The bitter herbs, halacha 13, the 13th halacha. The bitter herbs, maror, referred to by the Torah are romaine lettuce, endives, horseradish, date ivy, I don't know what date ivy is, and wormwood. And there is debate whether or not horseradish works. Bear in mind that some of these terms are vague and we don't know exactly what some of them are. All of these 5 species of vegetable are called maror. If a person ate a kazait of any one of these species or of all 5 species combined, he has fulfilled the obligation. This applies while they are still moist. One may fulfill one's obligation with their stem even if it is dry. One cannot fulfill one's obligation if they are boiled, pickled, or cooked. And that concludes chapter 7. Here we see in the commentary an admission that the precise English term for the latter species is a matter of question. All right, so tomorrow, Be'ezrat Hashem, with God's help, we will continue with the 8th chapter of the laws of Passover. And these are the laws for what we can do nowadays without making the Passover sacrifice. You will find the laws regarding how to make the Passover sacrifice in a different part of the Mishneh Torah. On that note, Shalom Uvracha. V'Hag Kasher V'Sameach.